4.1 Ethical and Legal Issues. During the World War II, the Nazis in Auschwitz conducted very unethical human experimentations, such as experiments on twins, bones, muscle or nerve transplantation experiments, head injury experiments, freezing experiments, malaria experiments, immunization experiments, mustard gas, sulfonamide experiments, seawater, sterilization experiments, experiments with poison, incendiary bomb experiments, and high-altitude experiments. These inmates were forced to participate in experimentations in which often led to disabling harm or death against their will, and social humiliation, also causing psychological distress. In 1947, after the war, the researchers were exposed at the doctor's trial in Nuremberg in Germany. An ethical code with 10 key points was declared. As you can see here, here's a list of it. After this, in 1964, the World Medical Association was established and declared the Helsinki for Ethical Principles for Research with Human Volunteers. The declaration promotes safeguarding health and ensures all researches are conducted professionally to prevent poor practice. This is continuously reviewed so the participants and researchers are always protected. If anyone breaks the ethical codes or malpractice is used, then there are legal repercussions. BASES stands for British Association in Sport and Exercise Science. They were founded in the year 2000, and they accredit sports scientists. They have a code of conduct for sports science practitioners and researchers which they must follow. Researchers must obtain ethical approval by BASES assessing their experiments. If this code of conduct is broken, there are legal sanctions. All researchers must make a protocol, consent form, expectations and safety. They must be an application to an independent specialist panel, and the risk of harm may be judged with the benefits to society to ensure volunteers, researchers and organisations are protected. I'll be looking at Zimbardo and Milgram's study. Zimbardo did the Stanford prison in 1971 and Milgram did the shock experiment in 1963. In the Stanford prison experiment, the aim was to see how quick people would conform to the roles they were given, be it guard or prisoner. Zimbardo found that after a few days in the experiment, some people had suffered psychological, physical, and emotional distress. The experiment was unethical because many of the participants were affected emotionally and psychologically, and also physically. Zimbardo didn't receive any legal penalties, but instead was used as an example of poor practice when researching on human subjects. The shock experiment. The aim was to see how far people would shock someone else if they were given instructions by an authority figure. This experiment was unethical because the participants had been exposed to a very stressful situation which could affect them psychologically, and the participants were also very distressed and very tense during the experiment, which is causing harm. The definition of ethical is moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or the conducting of an activity. It's a knowing the right and wrong, and there isn't any physical, psychological, social or emotional harm involved. Legal is just working within the boundaries of the law. This is my scenario 1. Here, the good practice, equality and impartiality. All girls were treated equally with or not they were overweight or of a different race or had any disabilities. This is a good practice because if there was inequality, then the girls could suffer from social and psychological harm depending on the extent of which they were mistreated, which is breaking the ethics of code of conduct. A bad practice, health and medical screening questionnaire. By getting the girls to do the questionnaire, they can find out any health problems they need to know, so then what kind of exercises they can and can't do. For example, if one has an injured leg and she can't move her leg and run properly, and if she didn't, it would injure. If she did, it would injure. Even more then performing these stretches would make her injury worse and harm the participant. The BASIS Code of Conduct clearly states that harm to the participant must be avoided, and as the researcher hasn't provided a health and screening questionnaire, then they haven't bothered to ensure the participant will be okay within their study. This could be a bad practice because there wasn't any consent form issued. The parents or the participant are being filmed. If the researcher was found out, then they would suffer legal penalties for breaking the code of conduct, resulting in ethical training. Debriefing. Another bad practice could be debriefing. The participants were not told verbally or in writing that was involved in the study. Some participants might not have liked the idea of being in certain positions as they might feel awkward and it would look as if they were in an intimate position to which the parents would objectify as well as the participants. This could result in the researchers being suspended or in reprimand. Data protection. The data used in this experiment was exposed without consent. The data should be protected under the Data Protection Act, founded in 1998, as it is a legal and ethical requirement. This also means a researcher has failed to their responsibility to look after the participants' data. As a consequence of this irresponsibility of the researcher, the girls could suffer psychological and social harm as information has been displayed for anyone to see. As a sanction, the researcher would automatically lose credibility for researching using human subjects and also lose their accreditation with BASIS and even possibly a fine. Scenario 2. Debriefing. Debrief. This is good practice. You can see in the scenario if researchers informing the participants so what is to come during the research, giving them time to decide whether they want to partake in this research. A bad thing that could be that the children were informed but the parents weren't, as they are not old enough to consent for their own safety. The volunteers. This is a sign of good practice because these participants have volunteered to partake in the research without being coerced. These participants are all allowed to receive incentives, but researchers cannot force these young gymnasts as long as it's under their will and of their parents, then the researcher are allowed to proceed. Bad practice, confidentiality and anonymity. This could be a sign of bad practice because there is a risk of exposure as the information is potentially embarrassing for which could cause social and psychological harm to the participants, leading to the researchers to pay fines. Equality and impartiality. The coach could have punished more one type of race, or with a disability or which is unequal and impartial, which could mean the researcher could get reprimand or suspension. If the punishments are too extreme, then they need time to evaluate their actions. Good practice, ethical clearance. The punishments must be approved by the ethics committee to proceed with the punishments. In this scenario, good practice is shown by the researchers making a project proposal form so they can be accepted by the institutional ethics review committee. The young girls could be physically or emotionally harmed, which is why it must be accepted by the committee to protect the participants. However, if the punishment given affects the girls physically or being abusive and pushing them to the limit of fear of the instructor and damage their emotion, if this happens, the researcher is failing their responsibility because they are not protecting their participants, they are not considering ethical issues before the study, they are not monitoring during the research for the benefit of the participant, and are definitely not competent. This would result in the researcher facing a tribunal sentence or fines and a prison sentence for being abusive to the participants. In this scenario, you can see that the researcher has created a participant disclaimer to say that there is a chance of risk, and and it isn't their fault, which, if anything did, would prevent the researcher from getting sued. And then scientific misconduct. In this scenario, they turn evaluation from other studies, and which could be plagiarism and stealing ideas. This would ultimately lead to the researcher getting sued for taking ideas of others' researchers and using their evaluations and data. For scenario 4, debrief, bad practice. The girls and parents must be fully informed and need to know what the substance is for and what it does and possible negative outcomes or side effects. This could result in the researcher having to go through ethical training to make sure the researcher fully knows and the reasons why the code of ethics is a legal obligation. Right to withdraw. The girls are allowed to withdraw if they don't like what is happening within the research. Not allowing them to withdraw is illegal, which could cost them their job and will lose their accreditation with BASES, but it is also unethical as it could cause harm. Informed consent. Before giving the substance, they should ask the girl's parents' consent so that the parent, with the permission of an adult, can make a sensible decision to whether they want their child to proceed in this research, knowing full well the um, possible outcomes, negative and positive. Ethical clearance. The substance must be approved to know that it is safe and appropriate to use, because if it's dangerous, then it could even possibly kill the participants or have other harming side effects. Deception. The gymnasts aren't told what is in the substance, which could be something illegal or perhaps something they're allergic to. And then risk-benefit analysis. This is a sign of good practice as researchers are outweighing the positive outcomes of the experiment compared to the risks and dangers of the research. Because if there was more dangers than there were positive outcomes, then there would be no point in doing this research, because all it is just harming the participants and and just putting them through a lot of harm, which is also illegal. And then health and safety. The health and safety check is a good sign of good practice and research with human subjects, because the researcher identifies the hazards and analyzes who is at risk and in what way. Then the research evaluates the risks and makes adequate control measures. Then after that, the researcher would record the significant findings and lastly review the assessment and rewrite as necessary. With these steps, then every hazard is identified and can be dealt with accordingly, and then it's important that it's always rewritten, and because there will be, science changes over time, things will be conducted differently, different equipment will be used, so there'll be more hazards, and also, and then everything needs to be checked over to make sure that harm to the participant is minimised.